Hi, and welcome back to lecture number 91. This is historical topic 9.2, Reagan and Conservatism. And our theme for today is politics and power. So the learning objective is explain the causes and effects of continuing policy debates about the role of the federal government over time. And Ronald Reagan's victory in the presidential election of 1980 represented an important milestone, allowing conservatives to enact significant tax cuts and continue the deregulation of many industries. So we've said this before, the 1980 election is a watershed moment for the conservative movement that had started back in 1964 with Barry Goldwater. One of the things that helped Ronald Reagan in his election was the breaking up of the New Deal coalition. The blue-collar workers who were normally voting for Democrats are now going to be attracted to the Reagan campaign. He's also going to be aided by fundraising from conservative groups like the Moral Majority. The Moral Majority was the group that was created by Jerry Falwell, and he was targeting areas or geographic locations where liberal Congress people, senators were campaigning for re-election and putting money against those campaigns for conservative candidates. One of the things that Reagan did during his presidency was deregulate industries. He was easing restrictions on financial institutions, on mergers and acquisitions, easing environmental regulations. Remember, the EPA that was created in the 1970s was an executive agency. So whoever is the head of the executive office has a lot of sway on how much regulation is going to be put in place. There was increased oil drilling and coal mining on federal land. All of these things are going to increase economic activity, but they're also going to have a negative effect on the environment. The economic ideology under Reagan is sometimes referred to as Reaganomics or supply-side economics. This means that tax cuts on the upper tax brackets, on the wealthier people in the country, are supposed to lead to more private spending, lead to more business investment, which would hopefully have more people being hired for jobs. And in 1981, he passed the Economic Recovery Tax Act, which cut taxes across the board: income taxes, corporate taxes, estate taxes, and capital gains taxes. The effect of these tax cuts was that the wealthier tax brackets that had previously been taxed more are now getting taxed considerably less. We still have a progressive tax system, meaning that the wealthier portion of the country is paying a greater percentage of taxes than the lower economic or wealth groups. However, the reduction was significant for those wealthier groups. He also cut spending in domestic programs, the things that had been popular or had been put in place under the Johnson administration as a part of the Great Society. And the cuts in the domestic programs for welfare are negated by the increase in defense spending because of the Cold War. So the spending doesn't actually change all of that much during the Reagan administration. And since the government is taking in less money through tax revenue, that means that deficits are going up. A deficit is any time that you are spending more money than you are bringing in. So you can see in the chart below that during the Reagan administration, we have really high deficits. All right, so conservatives argue that liberal programs were counterproductive in fighting poverty and stimulating economic growth. There was a case against these liberal programs was that the federal assistance programs that had been created under the Great Society and under the New Deal made people complacent, that private industry could take the place of some of those government services, and because government proved to be an artificial competitor, then those private industries were not currently able to step in and provide those services or enter those areas of business. So Reagan cut $40 billion from food stamps, student loan programs, and mass transportation systems. All right, so some of their efforts to reduce the size and scope of government met with inertia and liberal opposition, as many programs remained popular with voters. So the liberal opposition came from unions. They continued to strike and organize despite their falling membership. And the Democratic majorities in Congress continue to push back against some of the things that Reagan wanted. So through the 1980s, there was at least a Democratic majority in one of the two chambers of Congress. If you look at the years 1980 here to 1988, you see that the House of Representatives had a Democratic majority, and Reagan only enjoyed, Reagan enjoyed a Senate majority for 6 years of his term. Now, also voters came to rely on some of the programs that had been created under the New Deal and under the Great Society, like Social Security and Medicare. They had already been popular with voters, and it now seemed impossible to repeal those popular programs. However, under Reagan's administration, the contributions to Social Security were increased, and also the age at which someone could receive full benefits was pushed to age 67. George H.W. Bush was Reagan's vice president. He succeeded Reagan in the presidency in the 1988 election, and he campaigned on no new taxes. Unfortunately, the deficit and the recession that followed during his presidency forced him to increase taxes, which would cost him in the 92 election. All right, so policy debates continued over free trade agreements, the scope of the government's social safety net, and calls to reform the U.S. financial system. Now we're moving into the presidencies of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Under George H.W. Bush, the United States entered into the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. There was a worry, especially by labor unions, that this would mean that manufacturing jobs from the United States would now be moving to Mexico, where labor was cheaper. And if there were no tariffs going back and forth between goods, or on goods going back and forth from Mexico and the United States, then American companies could set up shop in Mexico and still send their goods to American consumers without any sort of extra price added on. And the reform to the U.S. financial system, there had been some bank failures in the 1980s that had cost taxpayers. We'll see this again in the Great Recession of the 2000s. We'll have an entire lecture on the economy throughout all of period 9, which we will touch on the Great Recession and how deregulation was one of the factors for that coming about. All right, so as far as the size of the government safety net, under Bill Clinton, he passed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, which can just be summarized as welfare reform. If you refer to this as welfare reform of 1996, the College Board will give you points for this. But essentially what it did is that it took the responsibility of administering welfare from the federal government, and it gave it to the states. The states are given greater power in distributing this money and putting limits on who is able to receive it. The Congress that passed this was a Republican Congress, and Clinton was a new kind of Democrat. He was from the South, and so he shared some of the same ideology of trying to have a smaller federal government in some regards. And then under the Bush administration, there was a short-lived attempt to privatize Social Security, meaning that any money that is put into Social Security by any individual is going to go into a private Social Security account for that individual, and then whenever the person retires, they can draw on the money that they themselves contributed. The current system, or the way that the system exists, is that the contributions that you put in today actually go to pay out the withdrawals of people who had already contributed in the past. The reason why George W. Bush had proposed this was because there was a fear that the Social Security Trust was going to run dry as the baby boomer generation retired, and that there were not going to be enough workers to contribute enough in order for the baby boomers to have enough for their retirement. All right, so conservative beliefs regarding the need for traditional social values and a reduced role for government advanced in U.S. politics after 1980. Reagan and Bush added to the conservative majority on the Supreme Court. That more conservative court led by William Rehnquist put a couple more restrictions on abortion. So the 1973 Roe versus Wade court case that gave a wide range or a wide availability to abortion has now been scaled back. Planned Parenthood versus Casey said which restrictions would be allowable or which would be constitutional and which would not. And then also with affirmative action. With Gratz versus Bollinger, this was a case regarding the University of Michigan. The Supreme Court said that someone cannot just get automatic points on their application for being of a different race. However, it does continue to uphold affirmative action programs in the United States. We have gun rights in the United States with DC versus Heller, McDonald's versus Chicago, essentially saying that in order for you to own a gun or handgun or any sort of firearm, you don't need to be part of a militia, as the Second Amendment states. And then later in 2010 with McDonald versus Chicago, that previous court case, or it incorporates the Second Amendment into the states, essentially saying that the states can't put any restrictions on gun ownership. All right, we have reduced role for government. Was mostly in regulations and welfare. That's what the conservatives were looking at. That was their main concern, or where they wanted to reduce government intervention. Because as part of the conservative presidents, we have the Brady Act come about. This was a piece of legislation that passed Congress that allowed for background checks and a waiting period for gun sales. This was the inspiration for this act was Reagan's press secretary, who had been badly injured in the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan in 1981. And then George H.W. Bush passes the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, in 1990, which, because of its regulatory nature in making sure that buildings and public places have accommodations for people who are disabled or need mobility access, increases the size of the federal government. All right, intense and political and cultural debates continued over issues such as immigration policy, diversity, gender roles, and family structures. We're going to have an entire lecture on immigration policy in 9.3. That's the next lecture. But you'll see here in 1986, Ronald Reagan passes the Immigration Restriction Control Act that provides for amnesty for any undocumented migrants that had come to the United States before 1983. It created a waiting period that if they were not in trouble with the law for the next 5 years, they could gain full citizenship. And it started to create a new system for enforcing immigration legislation or immigration policy, and it put the responsibility on individual employers. It created penalties for anyone who employed undocumented workers. Reagan thought that this would be the best way at taking away the incentive for undocumented immigrants coming into the United States, and if businesses could not hire them or could not legally pay them. In 2012, President Obama passed the executive order, or issued the executive order, the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, and that allowed for anyone who came to the United States in an undocumented manner as a child to be allowed to stay in the United States, to be able to work, to get a driver's license, and to continue to stay in the United States, not be deported, again, as long as they are staying out of trouble and not having problems with the law. And then with diversity, conservatives, they oppose affirmative action programs, and the most recent affirmative action court case is Fisher versus the University of Texas at Austin in 2016, and it said that the University of Texas, their use of race as part of their admissions passes the constitutional test. So the consideration of race is still allowed, but there is a strict scrutiny standard that must be passed. With family structures, conservatives oppose same-sex marriage. The conservative Congress passed the Defense of Marriage Act, and it was also signed into law by President Clinton. But that was overturned by Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, which said that any restrictions on same-sex marriage by the states is unconstitutional. The White House put up rainbow-colored lights the day that the decision was announced. And we also see that single women are starting to, there is a rise in single women-led households from 5.5 million in 1970 to 12.8 million in the year 2000. So this is a demographic shift in the United States that is of a high concern, because single parent households are usually lower income, and if there are kids involved that need services or they need access to certain things, they may be less likely to get them from a single parent household than from a two-parent household. And for gender roles, women still are experiencing the wage gap. The Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act was passed in 2009 under the Obama administration, and it increased the recourse for discrimination. So women could not sue an employer for discriminatory pay past 180 days after their first paycheck. The Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act made it so that once someone retired or once someone left a job and then they found out that they had been underpaid the whole time compared to their male counterparts, they could still go back and sue their former employer for their discriminatory wages. Lilly Ledbetter, seen on the bottom left, essentially had to experience this. She worked at Goodyear, retired. After a couple of months of being retired, she found out that she had been underpaid compared to her male counterparts for the entire time that she worked there. But because she had already quit and she had already passed the statute of limitations on the Fair Pay Act, she was never able to get the recourse for her discriminatory wages. All right, so that was it. Reagan's presidency focused on tax cuts, cuts on spending, and deregulation. There was resistance from voters and liberals to cuts on popular programs. Conservatives favored free trade agreements, reducing the scope of government and deregulating financial systems. Social conservatives made ground on issues like abortion, affirmative action, and gun rights through Supreme Court decisions. And finally, cultural debates on immigration, diversity, family structures still continue to the present day. Thank you for watching. I will see you again on the next lecture, in which we will be talking about immigration during period 9. I'll see you then.